I'm glad you're here. This is the Ranch Horse Resource Podcast, and I'm Rhonda Van Norman. I co-host this show along with my husband, Ty. Most of what we talk about comes from our real ranch work, things that worked and, yeah, some that don't. We like to break down the day-to-day work with our horses and share the key takeaways. But today's episode is just a little different. We're stepping back about 25 years and talking about how we started colts on our place back then. Things have changed a lot since then, and we don't use the same model for starting our colts that we did back then. But I think there's a lot that's still worth remembering and maybe taking another look at. I know not everyone can set up their program in the same way it was then. It took a good crew, a good set of colts, all about the same age and having the same stage of maturity, and the Van Normans had a location that suited the situation. It was perfect. Those guys had a lot of feel, they had timing, they knew how to let the horse figure things out without getting him fried. We might not be able to replicate the exact program the way that Ty explains it in this episode, but there's pieces of it, important pieces, that I think we can all learn from, apply to what we're doing now, and keep it going. So in this episode, you're going to hear part of that conversation, what it looked like then, how it worked, and some of the inside story. If you want, as you listen, maybe ask yourself, what part of this could you bring into the way that you handle your own horse? All right, let's get into it. Ty, tell us a little bit about the background you had growing up and the horse program as you remember it.
We were raising horses on the ranch. Quarter horses. There, not that there wasn't something else thrown in there now and then to start, but for the most part, that's what they were, colts that we raised. We started a few outside colts, and there was always somebody that would have some colts to start that would come over and spend a week with us starting colts. Depending on how many we had, we'd start them all in February in an indoor barn my grandpa built in the end of the 70s. It was probably 100 by 70, but with a round krill in the corner. February was the month that we started colts, so they weren't quite 2-year-olds yet. My dad had tried to get them on alfalfa. We raised as much as they could eat at least a month or two before we started them. So that wintertime, most of the fall work was done. Everything was weaned. The cows were just getting fed, so we'd feed cows for half a day. Everybody had different places they went to feed cattle. And if we had to ride through some of the calves, because we would keep our calves back and run them in a different area for the summer. So we retained our ownership on our calves most of the time. When all that was done in the morning, then usually we would go to the barn and ride colts. There was times where there was, close to 20 head of colts there. We'd just try to split them in half. We'd ride half of the colts for, 12, 15 rides. So 12 or 15 days, basically. And then we'd get the next batch up. So it'd last about a month, maybe a little longer, depending on what the days were. And there'd be anywhere from 3 to 6, 8 of us, just depending on who was there, who came to watch us ride colts, or who came to, maybe somebody brought their own colts to help start colts. We'd start off in the round corral. First day, usually we just saddled them and turned them loose, let them wear the saddle, moved them around a little bit. Second day, we'd saddle them up, let them move around a little bit, put them back in the round corral and get on them, ride them around in there. And third day, we'd do the same thing we did the day before, but that time we might go out into the arena from the round corral with just a halter on, and we just basically went along for a ride. And when you got a chance to try to start teaching them to steer with a halter, you could. And then over the next few days, we'd progressively hang a bit in their mouth with maybe on a piece of twine or something first, just to let them chew on it and still ride them with the halter. We'd progress them into riding them around in a snaffle bit, and we'd stay in the barn probably for 4 or 5 days. And then we'd start working our way outside of the barn. It depended on which end of the barn you went out of. The one end was pretty slick and and kind of incline or decline, however you want to say it. You'd be leaving the barn going downhill into a lot where all the weaner colts were kept from that year or every year. And so it would be kind of packed snow and ice, and you'd slide around down there. And
so did you go out when there was other horses loose?
No, we'd lock the colts up so you weren't getting tangled up with a bunch of loose colts or kicked. And like I said, there'd be 3 to 8 of us anyways, most of the time starting colts. So there was always a buddy that you could get hooked on. We'd leapfrog each other around there. Meaning, like, I'd take the lead for a second, and then the next person would go by me and take the lead, and we could kind of get our colts to following each other that way. I mean, if you went out the back side of the barn, then that was kind of a little flat area, and then you started up the mountain. So the snow could be kind of deep up there. It might be, depending on the year, it might be chest deep up there, so you could air one out pretty good up there. There was always a lot of mule deer around there when I was growing up, so we'd hit a deer trail or something like that, go off across the side hill, mountainside or something through the bushes, and lots of brush and Salisbury bushes and stuff to go around and maneuver, rocks. And
so you guys always did this in the winter?
Yes. Yeah, that was the time, as far as the ranching seasons, that was the time that we did that. Yeah, it seems like all the other times like everything's about seasons, ranching. So, that was our window. February was kind of our window. March, we started taking the cattle down to the other end of the ranch to start calving. So then you started calving around the 10th of March. So, and a lot of times December and January, we were still trying to kind of get fall works finished. We'd put, 12, 15 rides on them. But the last 5, 6 rides would be outside. Well, we'd ride them over to my uncle's place, from my grandpa's to my uncle's place, where the cookhouse was open then, and we'd eat lunch over there. So, you could steer them and go somewhere. We rode a lot in packs. Those colts are pretty comfortable riding with each other, as far as that goes. They're not, you'd get off by yourself somewhere, kind of, but you still were within sight of the other colts. So sometimes they'd run off to get to the other ones, and you just dealt with that. But they slowly got figured out that they didn't need to get so bothered about being by themselves, because it wasn't going to be long they'd be back together. So they could kind of feed off each other and not worry so much about you forcing them to do anything. People run into that type of problem when they're starting colts by themselves. Is the colt at a certain point feels like they're picking on them, kind of. But when we were starting them all together like that, those colts they'd draw to another colt, so you could kind of switch back and forth, and pretty soon they're steering and they're riding around pretty nice.
Now, Ty, you mentioned that there was usually 3 to 8 guys. I came in the picture in 1997, but there was never a year that I remember that your dad wasn't there. He helped you guys start colts every year until he was gone, but he was a very good hand, very good with colts. You and your brother kind of both helped with the colts, and sometimes your sister. And all 3 of you had grown up with the knowledge of good horsemanship and understanding pressure and release and how to keep a horse from getting too bothered. You had been around other good hands that just modeled for you patience and consistency and the whole process. So for you guys, just as a family, that was enough of you to keep things going in a pack. But I know you had some hired hands and off and on friends and neighbors that would come over. So tell us a little bit more about that, what it was like being around everyone that was so handy.
I don't know that you spent a whole lot of time thinking about that, I guess, as far as that goes. Or my grandpa Charlie Van Norman built the barn in, I would say, the end of the 70s or the early part of the 80s, right? Well, about then's when my grandpa Ray Hunt, my mom's dad, was starting to go or doing clinics around. So Grandpa Charlie hosted a Ray Hunt clinic at the barn there at the ranch. And so that's where Troy and I started our first colts when we were kids. And I don't know how old we were then, 10 and 12. I was 2 years older than Troy, somewhere in there, I would say. And so that was, of course, in grade school, we had school all winter long, so it wasn't like, I don't think we got to start many colts in grade school. It wasn't until later on that Dad started timing it where we were on either spring break or mostly the end of our Christmas break or something. We might get a chance to start summer being on that. But February was not really a holiday month for school, so I don't really remember starting Colts as like in grade school. I do remember like high school and stuff where, and it would have probably mostly been weekends for Troy and I that we got to start Colts, or ride the Colts on the weekends at the guy's dad and the hired man. And usually he had a couple hired men helping through the winter season. And then, like I said, neighbors and other people would show up for a certain point of time to just be around my dad and my grandpa about as far as the way they started Colts and stuff and their horsemanship. So as far as me thinking about it, I guess that's what we were doing. It was a season thing. I appreciate it now that I'm older and can think about it and what actually was going on there. As far as recognizing it for being something completely different than the rest of the world at the time, it was just our normal thing.
Now, when you say completely different, I remember thinking the first time I saw the way you guys started Colts that it was completely different than anything I had been around. Partly because I hadn't witnessed the whole Ray Hunt clinics, and I think that he probably did similar Colt starting sessions in his clinics, but I hadn't seen them. But to have all the Colts in one corral and run them around together before you got on them, and then even after you got on them, well, everybody would be in the corral at the same time, was a completely new thought. And I remember thinking, this is going to be disaster. And to my surprise, it was really quite the opposite. But I also saw that there was a lot of forethought, especially from your dad. He was sort of like the director of the show. He would have a flag or something, and he'd move those Colts around on foot before you guys ever got on them. They'd all be going the same way. And then he'd switch directions, and then they'd go the other way. It wasn't completely like a free-for-all in there. There was some direction, even though they were loose.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, like the first few days where we just saddled them and turned them loose, someone would kind of get in there and just move them around a foot. If Dad did it a lot of times, sometimes he'd have Troy or I do it, and in the round corral, it just kind of depended. So couple things I remember, like riding, starting Colts especially with my dad, because like you didn't want to be the last one on. I don't care what you had to do. If you had to mount him on the run, you got on, because if Dad got on before you got on, then stuff was going to start happening really fast, or it's going to get wilder and it's going to get harder to get on. So that was one thing that if there was one that had an issue with just needing more time, then we would set that time aside and work with just that horse and get that person on, first. But I do remember just on the general consensus, like when we get to the round craft, we ran them around, outside, and we get them to the round corral, man, you got your Colt start caught as quick as you could. And he loved starting Colts. I think that was probably the thing that I don't want to say he enjoyed the most, because I just think he enjoyed cowboying and being a rancher, but riding Colts was probably one of his most favorite things. So he was always goosing your Colt or doing something to expose those Colts when he went by. Usually, he was doing enough to his own Colt, but usually he was going to do something to your Colt too on the way by. It wasn't like he was trying to get you bucked off or not, but nothing. But it's just one of those things. And he was well aware of where everybody else's Colts were and what they were doing, as far as, he wasn't going to go over there and goose one that he knew could buck, or something like that. But he dang sure goose one if he knew it was going to grab itself and take off. So that was one reason you didn't want to you wanted to ride on the offense. Because if you would just be completely overwhelmed if you were trying to ride on the defense, so you needed to get in your saddle and get hunkered down and start doing something before he got there. Because I remember going around there one time and he just reached over there and grabbed a saddle blanket off the saddle that was hanging on the fence and threw it at another guy. And pretty soon we're passing the saddle blanket. We were tearing around that round corral for a while. I think there were 6 of us in there. And pretty soon we were all passing the saddle blanket back and forth to each other. And we did that a lot. We played tag. We did all kinds of different games on our colts once we got up there, to try to, they just get better at handling, and like if you get somebody that's kind of a timid rider or not super aggressive, once they get kind of into the game, they'll get better at riding their horse better and not be worried about the colt. The more that colt you're worried up there, the more that colt's going to be apprehensive too.
Yeah, I think I remember that a little bit. Things weren't just slow and smooth and take one step at a time, but it wasn't chaos either.
No.
There wasn't a lot of broncs, and there wasn't a lot of horses that got bothered.
Where horses get bothered is when their feet get stuck. So even you can get one to move its feet. So that's what he was, a lot of cases, that's what was happening. We were getting their feet to move. Once you get their feet moving, then you can kind of get a step here or there steering them, or, they'll go through a little spurt there where they kind of grab themselves, but they breathe. They'll start breathing better too. Like there's, the feet will get stuck and they'll hold their breath, and then pretty soon they're so fearful they can't do anything but explode one way or the other, kind of deal. So just the freedom for them to be able to feel like they could move to go somewhere. That's why a lot of times when we get on them, we just let them go wherever they wanted. We just engage their feet, just get them going. It didn't matter where they went. The first few days, we didn't pull on them or do a whole lot of anything, especially when they were fresh. You just rode them, you petted on them, and you rode them. You just went where they went. And one thing that helped me when I first starting colts is, because I've always been fairly big, we had a neighbor, Randy Bunch, that showed me how to hobble my stirrups. And that made a world of difference in my confidence on riding those smaller horses. I mean, granted, some of them were like strapping your saddle to a panel. They were super wobbly underneath you as far as just quick. Like they could be so quick to shoot across the arena and suck back at the fence. And when he showed me how to hobble my stirrups, it just gave me a whole bunch of confidence in being able to ride through all that, because I could just kind of push on my stirrups and push myself up against my cantle and push my feet. My feet would be locked down with those hobbled stirrups. And then you could ride through some really quick divey stuff and not feel like you were getting whipped around on top to where you're out of position and scaring the colt. I guess that was my main thing. I guess the reason I say that is some horses, when they suck back or drop out from under you or something, they get you out of position, and then it's hard to recover, especially when everything feels like it's rolling, like your saddle doesn't feel tight, and then you wind up scaring them more than anything. I don't know that I ever had any actually really buck with us. I don't know that we had any that actually really bucked. There was a few times that, some dang sure did buck. But for the most part, most of the thing you're dealing with is him just getting scared of another colt coming at him with somebody on him or something like that, and they take off running and suck back at the fence or something like that. Those were the most of the high-speed, quick things that you would face more than any type of bucking and stuff like that. They dang sure might buck the first time they were saddled the first day. In fact, most of us would like to see them buck the first day with the saddle, because if they didn't buck the first day, usually they would try you somewhere along the line, third or fourth day. But like I said, I don't know. Like that's how we started them when I was growing up. And I don't know if that's something that kind of came on when Tom Dorrance came in the country, or my dad learned it from Tom through one of his clinics, or they discussed it. They were always visiting with each other, as far as that goes. I think before my granddad and my dad had started raising a bunch of horses, it was on an individual starting basis, like there was a round crell at the place where we lived. I remember hearing stories, this way before, Mike, we had been little kids, Dad hadn't a colt saddled or started or was starting one in the summer, but it was like a it wasn't like they had a whole herd of colts like when we were growing up. I mean, by then they were raising enough colts that there was maybe 15 to 20 head of colts there that we had raised ourselves, not to mention some of the outside horses that showed up to get started or somebody came to ride. But I think previous to that, they'd buy a colt here or there, or they'd have a colt here or there. And I don't think it was like in a big group like that. I think there might be just one or two of them. Like Dad and Randy Bunch started a lot of colts when my dad was growing up. They'd go over to Willis Packers and start colts, or get some of his colts and bring them somewhere and start them. And I think it was just the two of them starting them. And a lot of times those colts were older, 4 and 5 year olds. But I don't know when or how. I think some of it had to do with the fact that my dad liked to show and was wanting to go show it more of what was turning into the NRCHA and the California stock horse stuff. And the futurity stuff was, 3-year-olds. So I think that's when people were starting to get them started younger and younger. And so, like I said, we put 15 to 20 rides, or 12 to 15, just kind of depending on what we had time for. If we might had one holdover, that if it needed a few more rides, we'd wait it for the second batch and maybe turn it out halfway through the second batch if he was doing good or something like that. So you might have one that gets 20 or 25 rides on it. That winter in February, they'd get turned out all summer, all spring and summer, till the next fall. We'd run them all in. Dad had split them out to all of us, whoever was working here or whoever had, time to ride. So like when I got out of college and moved home, I'd have a couple of my own and try to ride one ranch one for the ranch too. So a lot of times I could take 3 in the fall, and I'd just saddle them and pack them with me on our fall works. Take an older horse. If I needed to go check a gate or something, I could ride one of those colts. Otherwise, I spent time tied to the trailer, rubbing the crap out of your saddle on the trailer and pawing a hole. But that was all good for them, as far as that goes. And pretty soon, as the cows started coming in, and if there was 4 of us, 2 of us would be on colts, or maybe, and the other 2 on older horses, and we'd all take turns working the gate. Like, there was no one man worked the gate and let all the sorted calves off the cows and stuff. We rotated in and out of there a lot, which was cool because it didn't take long for those colts to figure out how to get back through themselves and across the pen, as far as sorting calves off the cows and stuff like that. We had a lot of fall work that was fun for those colts, and they just got better and better. And then a lot of times after the fall works, mine would kind of get the winter off, and then it was my job to calve the heifers, and those 3 colts would wind up, that'd be my main mounts for riding through the heifers twice a day. And eventually we'd get to brand a few little calves on them in the spring, and then they'd usually get turned back out for the summer that year, or most of the summer. You might get them in somewhere along the line, but then after that summer off, then they were pretty much on the payroll. So I guess that's a progression of what they went through.
Well, I wonder if you enjoyed that as much as I did, but hopefully it gave you a glimpse of how our colts were started back then. And like I said in the beginning, it's not about trying to go back and do everything exactly the same way. Shoot, time changes way too much for that. But there's a lot there worth paying attention to, and we're going to get into more of the details of that in our next episode. It's going to be a part 2 of the colt starting with Bill Van Norman, why it worked, and why it still matters. So we're looking forward to keeping that conversation going. Ty will talk a little bit more about what he learned, what's important for the horse, and even some of the things that he still does with his horses today from the model back then. So if you enjoy colt starting and good horsemanship, I bet you're going to want to catch up on that one too. By chance, if this got you thinking about your own situation or maybe something you've ran into, we'd love to hear about it. Send us an email at hello@ranchhorseresource.com. And if you want help applying any of this, you can certainly book a one-on-one coaching call. That's something I wouldn't put off if I were you. You can head on over to ranchhorseresource.com. We'll see you next week. Until then, like my dad always used to say, you gotta laugh a little and have some fun.